My father had several brothers who lived in different parts of the country. They rarely saw each other, but they kept in touch through letters, so they knew everything about each other. One of his brothers lived in the mountains and had been inviting my father to come visit and go fishing for a long time. In their village, fishing was the main occupation. Everyone there had been trained in this craft and knew how to protect their catch from any troubles. My dad and I were avid fishermen, and this vacation we decided to visit our relative at the far end of the country to hang out and fish. But then something unexpected happened. The day before our departure, with everything packed and ready, I came home from work and found my dad in a cast. He had somehow tripped on the street and tore a ligament in his leg. Naturally, the trip was out of the question now. Dad sat sadly in his chair, turning an envelope from his brother over in his hands. "Just my luck," he said. "We'll have to return the tickets." I was upset too. "Ignacio, why don't you go alone? You're fit as a fiddle, no need to waste the vacation. Go ahead, you can tell me all about it and show me the pictures later. I hope you remember to bring the camera." "I'll go next year if I'm still alive and well," Dad suggested. So, we decided I would return Dad's plane ticket and take the same flight to the mountains. The journey was tough, several hours by plane, then by bus, and various rides. But it was worth it. By tradition, they welcomed me as an honored guest with a feast. Mr. Carlos was, of course, disappointed that my dad couldn't come but said he'd be waiting for him next year. In the evening, we had dinner at Mr. Carlos's place. My cousin Eusebio, Mr. Carlos's son, and his friends drank quite a bit in honor of my arrival and more. The next morning, we woke up with pounding heads and dry mouths. We decided to postpone the fishing trip to the forest by a day. Mr. Carlos grumbled about wasting time but eventually gave in. "Why is he so worried?" I asked my cousin Eusebio. "A day earlier, a day later. He's got everything ready for fishing, and old forester Mr. Lucas is probably waiting for us. But it's okay, he's used to waiting." The next day, the three of us, my cousin, Mr. Carlos, and I, set off for the forester's cabin and arrived by evening. The scenery was stunning. I'd probably live there forever if I didn't love city life so much. It must be what heaven on earth looks like. Grandpa Lucas had already set the table, and the main dish among the natural abundance was fish roasted on coals. Afterward, we decided to take a walk along the riverbank, breathe in the forest air deeply, and stretch our stomachs after the hearty dinner. The wooden forester's cabin stood right on the riverbank, next to a spot where a net was set in the water. Nearby was a wooden shed that looked like an outhouse and a large cage. "What's that odd structure?" I asked the forester. "An outhouse?" "No," he replied, pointing in the opposite direction. "That's Luis's house." "Like the boogeyman?" I joked. "You're the boogeyman. Let's go inside, I'll tell you everything," the forester said. At this point, my uncle tugged at my sleeve. "Listen, Ignacio, don't pester Grandpa with questions. He doesn't like talking about that story much. If he wants, he'll tell it. Otherwise, don't show too much curiosity." What could I do? Pester the old forester? I kept quiet. We went back inside and shared stories. That shed, which I still kept calling the outhouse in my mind, was clearly visible from where we sat. I was looking, and there was a huge bear quickly and stealthily dragging fish out of the net. I yelled, "Look, everyone, what's happening?" The old forest ranger looked out the window, observed carefully, and in a calm tone said, "Let Luis have a treat, he's earned it. And through the window, we quietly watched what was happening. Meanwhile, the bear stuffed his belly, then scratched his fur against the toilet with the cage, and leisurely, unhurriedly, satisfied with himself, strolled back into the forest. I must have had a look of universal bewilderment frozen on my face at that moment, and my silent question was evident in my eyes. But I was told not to pester with questions. And then Grandpa Lucas started speaking, telling a funny story, somewhat tragic, but I remember it to this day. Several years ago, there was a storm at night, began the ranger. The wind was so strong that trees were groaning and cracking. That night, the storm caused a lot of damage. A couple of days later, when the ground had dried a bit, I went out to inspect my territory, assess the damage. Toward the end of the day, I came across another tree fallen by the storm, and next to it was a skinny, exhausted bear cub. He could barely move when I found him. His mother had been killed by the thick tree, and the poor cub's paw was stuck in a tree crevice, with no chance of getting out. I freed the little guy and carried him to the cabin, built him a small house with a cage, and settled him there. Fishermen often visit here, and the men really liked him. They named him Louis, as if I were his real father, having saved his life. I always wanted a son, but my family is all girls, wife, daughter, and granddaughter Paula. I raised the animal to the highest standard, accustomed him to people, and kept him at home. Louis was so harmless that sometimes his cage wasn't even locked, and he would happily wander near the riverbank, stealing the fisherman's catch. For this, the men would scold him severely, but the bear never got offended. He'd just go back as if nothing happened, waiting for the next opportunity. A year went by, Louis grew up, got stronger, and started going into the forest for longer periods, but the door to his cabin was never locked, in case he wanted to visit, have some fish. One summer, my granddaughter Paula insisted on staying with me at the cabin. Since childhood, I would take her to the forest. She loves it, isn't afraid of animals, can distinguish edible mushrooms from poisonous ones, and, most importantly, cooks excellently. She's a diligent girl, not spoiled. We raised her right. She'll make fish soup, fry mushrooms, make meat stew, clean the house. She's not afraid of any work, unlike city folks. So, it's good for both of us, and it's more fun together. One morning, I went into the forest as usual to check my territory, and Paula stayed behind, preparing dinner for Grandpa, cooking up a storm, smoke billowing from the chimney, spreading a delicious aroma all around. It was this very aroma that drew two men, who had escaped from prison. They had been wandering the forest for several days, tired, hungry, and cold. And here they found everything, a roof over their heads, delicious food, and a beautiful girl. Paula had just turned 14 then, and the scoundrels could see she was still a child, but would that stop them? They barged in, one started rummaging through the pots and pans, while the other approached Paula, clearly wanting to satisfy another kind of hunger. The poor girl was scared to death, lost her voice at first, then started screaming, but who would hear her in the forest? The brute slammed her face down on the table, pinned her down, and was about to unzip his pants, but fate had other plans for them that day. Just at that moment, Louis the bear decided to visit for some fish, heard Paula's screams for help, and it was lucky the thugs hadn't locked the cabin door. That's how they ended up in the bear's clutches. They were lucky he was still young, just over a year old, otherwise, they wouldn't have gotten out alive. When Louis attacked the ex-convict, Paula managed to free herself and hit the one searching for food over the head with a log, knocking him out. But Louis subdued the would-be rapist. Paula tied them both up while they were unconscious, and soon after, I returned from my rounds, and we took them tied up at gunpoint to the village. And Louis the bear still occasionally visits from the forest.